Good morning, and thank you for being here. Before I begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that Quest University Canada sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to live, work, and learn on this blessed territory. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge my positionality in this discussion as well. I'm a young, white man who grew up here on the west coast of British Columbia with all the privileges that entails. It's important for me to acknowledge my positionality because academics generally think of their research as objective, which is largely impossible. No matter how hard we try, our biases and blind spots will seep into our research. And this doesn't devalue what I'm going to share with you today, but it's important for you to remember that my biases will be included in this conversation. Now, how many of you know where the closest jail or prison is to us right now? All right. How many of you know how many prisons or jails there are in British Columbia? It's not really surprising that so few people know the answers to these questions. This is where they are. There's one much farther north. But generally, these are all the federal and provincial penitentiaries in the Greater Vancouver area. And this lack of awareness is generally pretty intentional. Prisons are kept out of the public eye and out of common discourse. And a lot of us are pretty okay with that. The common line of thinking goes, I haven't committed a crime, so why should I care about prisons and the people in them? And this is a really important question. It brings up a really important topic. Because we generally deem prisoners as deserving of their fate. And because of this, there's a general lack of public awareness and concentration. And this has allowed massive inequalities to permeate our criminal justice system. And nowhere is this more evident than in our prisons. Now, before I go any further, I just want to give you a little synopsis of my background. As Oliver mentioned, I did go to Quest. I graduated this past December, and I hope to begin law school this coming fall. Now, while at Quest, my question was, are we equal? The short answer is no. I primarily studied the Canadian criminal justice system, Canadian elections, and the federal policymaking apparatus, and I investigated how these different institutions treat different Canadians unequally. And I examined the implications of these inequalities on our system of democracy. So I want to start with a brief history of the modern penitentiary system. It might surprise you to learn that our current method of locking people up as punishment really hasn't been around that long. It used to be that prisons were only used to hold criminals until the time of their punishment, which was usually either corporal or monetary. Think fines, whippings, and hangings. And this brings up an important topic, the purpose of prisons. Before the 1800s, the primary purpose of prisons was temporary detention. Other than political or religious prisoners, and sometimes debtors, most people didn't spend very long in prisons, and the time they spent in them wasn't actually part of their punishment. This is because the modern penitentiary system was first introduced by the Philadelphia Quakers in 1789, and they viewed it as a more humane alternative to other forms of punishment that were commonly used at the time. The Quakers believed that a sentence of imprisonment served under terms of isolation with opportunities for work and religious contemplation would render inmates penitent and reformed. The idea was that after serving their time, they would re-emerge, rehabilitated, and ready to rejoin society. And this idea is probably pretty familiar to most of you. Our current prison system operates under a very similar logic. Ideally, our current prison system has four main objectives. They are retribution, detention, deterrence, and rehabilitation. Now, we do the first two quite well. We're pretty good at catching people and locking them up. It's the second two that are more complicated. Now, the question of whether prisons deter people from committing crimes has actually turned out to be a much more complicated question than we originally thought. It largely has to do with whether a person views the system of punishment as legitimate or not. And then there's rehabilitation. And this is a big one, and it's one we're just simply not doing enough of. Now, here in Canada, I think it's pretty common for us to think of ourselves in relation to the United States. They're right there, that row. And I think it's pretty easy for us to think about our governmental institutions, and maybe something's gone wrong, or it's not working out so well. Have you seen how bad it is in the States? And I think this line of reasoning is pretty common, and especially common when we talk about the United States' system of mass incarceration. I think it's pretty easy as Canadians to kind of look down there and go, wow, that is so brutal. How can they have it so bad? And the numbers are pretty staggering. Today in the United States, over 2 million people are incarcerated. According to the Pew Research Center, approximately Black Americans have roughly 5 times the chance of being imprisoned than their white counterparts. And so as Canadians, I think it's pretty easy to look at these numbers and think pretty well of ourselves, right? Well, maybe not so much. In fact, Canada has a massive racism problem within our criminal justice system. And nowhere is that more evident than in regards to the incarceration of Indigenous individuals. Let me try and break this down a little bit for you. Clearly, we don't have as many total people incarcerated in Canada. We just don't have that many people. The problem with the Canadian criminal justice system only becomes clear when you start breaking down the numbers. So let's do that. Today, Indigenous people make up roughly 4% of the Canadian population. However, they make up roughly 26% of all federally incarcerated individuals. This slide breaks down the Canadian population and the Canadian prison population by racial group. Gray represents Indigenous people. So that's almost a 7-fold increase in Indigenous representation when you go into prison. In comparison, since we've already talked about the United States, Black Americans make up roughly 12% of the United States general population. And they do make up 33% of all incarcerated individuals in the United States. So that's a 3-fold increase. That's terrible. But if that's terrible, then what does that say about Canada's 7-fold increase? This situation has become so dire that Canadian journalist Nancy MacDonald has begun referring to Canadian prisons as the new residential schools. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the residential school system was a system of planned and forced assimilation and cultural genocide that was perpetuated by the Canadian government. Indigenous children were separated from their parents and families and taken to schools where they were not permitted to speak their languages, practice their culture or tradition. Abuse was systematic, and the trauma of this system still bleeds through multiple generations of Indigenous peoples today. So how did we get here? Well, it's complicated. It includes a wide range of factors, including Canada's colonial history, present racial and socioeconomic inequalities. But it also corresponds, this rise of Indigenous incarceration also very interestingly correlates with the closing of residential schools across Canada over the last century. Now, of course, it is more complicated than that. I'm going to try to walk you through how this happened. So it begins with racial profiling. According to a joint investigation in 2015 by the Toronto Star, Maclean's, and Discourse Media, Indigenous individuals have a much higher rate of being stopped and questioned by police officers. Now, these more frequent stops generally lead to more arrests, which brings us to court, where in the 15 years leading up to 2009, the number of Indigenous Canadians who were denied bail jumped by 92%. So next comes biased sentencing. A 1990 study by LaPrairie found that on average, Indigenous individuals can expect to face harsher sentences for the same offenses as their white counterparts. In fact, this problem became so pronounced and so bad that in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that sentencing judges must consider an offender's history of dislocation, disadvantage, addiction, and abuse when considering sentencing. They must do everything in their power to prevent sentencing Indigenous peoples to more jail time. This process of consideration is now called the Gladot Report. Unfortunately, though maybe not surprisingly considering up here giving this talk, these have been less effective than we had hoped. In fact, legal scholars across Canada have considered them, with the University of Toronto's Ken Roach writing in 2010 that Gladue reports sometimes make little, if any, difference in the sentencing of Aboriginal peoples in serious cases. And so we end up in prison. And an independent review of Ontario corrections found, and bear with me here, that Indigenous people are more likely to be forcibly restrained in prison. They're more likely to be involved in the use of force incidents by guards. They're more likely to receive institutional charges, whether they be monetary or additional time. They're more likely to be placed in solitary confinement. And once there, they're more likely to spend longer in solitary confinement. They also make up 45% of all self-harm cases, and 9 in 10 are held for the entirety of their sentence, versus 6 in 10 of non-Indigenous inmates. And finally, Indigenous inmates are more likely to die in prison than any other population of inmates. So what can we do about this? Firstly, we need to start talking about it as often as possible. The modern penitentiary is built with high walls to keep people inside. But those same high walls block our view of what happens inside. And frankly, too many of us have been okay with this problem, with this situation, for too long. We need to start having real conversations about the efficacy of our prison system and evaluate whether it does more harm than good in its current iteration. But until we start having these conversations, until we make this a political issue that candidates can lose elections over, I don't think we're going to see change. The burden is on all of us to make this happen. I firmly believe that the first step in solving any problem is acknowledging that there is one. Canada's prisons are systematically racist and are perpetuating a system of discrimination that has its roots in Canada's colonial history. If we as a country are serious about our desire for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, this has to change. So let's get started. Thanks very much.